Chapter 13 The Banquet. The carriage arrived at the magistrate's palace, a huge and majestic all-white building adorned with imposing stone arches. Everything reflected the power and wealth of the city. As the carriage descended, Lorien held out his hand and helped Daenerys, Nerys and finally Rhaella down from the carriage. An entourage of slave women, dressed quite elegantly, seemed to be waiting for them. All the women looked at Lorien with shining eyes. Although rumors of such a young golden warrior had already spread, hearing was one thing and seeing it in person was a completely different matter. Especially seeing that Lorien was as terribly young as the rumors indicated. You could say that these women's dreams were to serve such a powerful man. Lord Lorien, the magistrates are waiting in the banquet hall. An older woman, around 50, spoke with an elegant smile, and despite the slave tattoo on her cheek, she acted more like a noble lady than a pleasure slave. Lorien nodded and followed the woman, but he couldn't help thinking that the magistrates were really arrogant. Even though they needed him, the three magistrates didn't even bother to greet him at the entrance to the mansion. Of course, this was a sign of power, but at the same time, it was a kind of contempt that Lorien deeply disliked. However, he didn't let his inner thoughts show on his face. However, Daenerys looked at Lorien and saw that his eyes had turned deep and cold. It wasn't just her who noticed. Nerys, Rhaella and Olsen also noticed the same thing and understood Lorien's thoughts. This made them realize that there might be something interesting going on at the feast. Daenerys couldn't help but think that the magistrates were really arrogant. Even bravos would show the best treatment and respect to Lorien, let alone a city like Myr. Stepping forward, Daenerys reached Lorien's side and entwined her arm around his arm while smiling adoringly at him. The Greek demigod looked at Daenerys and rolled his eyes, but didn't let go of her arm. Nerys looked at the scene with a touch of envy. She wanted to do the same, but she was taller than Lorien, which would create a funny contrast rather than a suitable one, so she remained a step behind Lorien. Arriving at the banquet hall, Lorien saw the three magistrates behind a long table full of food, wine and fruit. They didn't even get up and remained seated, even when he arrived. Seeing this, Lorien's eyes grew even deeper, but behind that depth, a chilling coldness was building up more and more. If anyone thought Lorien was a nice guy, they were very wrong. He wasn't called the tyrant prince casually. He didn't care about the wrath of Zeus and Hera. What was mere humans who didn't even have the power to speak in front of him? Caliros, at Ninety-4, looked as if he had been deprived of all his moisture. Dry, wrinkled skin and brittle, dry white hair surrounded his head, but in the center there was no hair. His dark brown eyes seemed especially deep. Durano was a middle-aged man with a smug, proud look on his face, a thick, voluminous, large beard falling over his chest. His hair was a light sandy shade and his eyes were blue. He was dressed solemnly and in gold. Joran was the youngest, about 30 years old. He looked cunning with his sunken cheeks and narrow eyes. When he smiled, it looked like he was up to something. He had medium-length dark hair and green eyes. He dressed more discreetly, but still richly. Lorien's first impression of the three magistrates of Myr was that they were a chaotic group with no apparent leader. He finally understood why Myr never really prospered more than expected. In comparison, Braavos was actually the richest city in the world, not just because it had only one voice, but because a solid community of interests made it possible for the city to grow economically. Of course, the fact that they had never been invaded by a Dothraki horde was also great marketing for merchants who wanted security in order to prosper. Braavos had a good leader and military strength that no free city could offer, which is why they are one of the largest cities on the planet. Myr was not only bogged down in infighting but also lacked a strong warrior to protect the city. Lord Lorien, seeing you in person is revealing. I've never heard of such a young golden warrior before. Caliros, the eldest of the magistrates, looked first at the exiled Targaryen queen and then at the princesses, especially Daenerys, who walked in with Lorien with her arms entwined. He narrowed his eyes and a few thoughts crossed his mind, but he didn't show any and continued smiling warmly. Although he still didn't stand up to show respect. I've also never heard of hosts not getting up or receiving their guests sitting down. Lorien smiled and spoke with a touch of sarcasm, looking at Caliros with a deep gaze. I must say, that's quite a reception, magistrates. The music stopped, the guests who were present stopped, even Garrick, the silver warrior who had invited Lorien had stopped, smiling, looking at the scene with interest. Caliros stopped smiling, but soon smiled back cordially. He stood up with a little difficulty and spoke with a sincere tone of apology. I apologize, Lord Lorien, I'm old and sometimes I forget things. I was busy too, a lot of work. Durano and Joran gave similar excuses, but Lorien just looked at them as if they were clowns, but had already decided that he would make all three of them die in due course. It's okay, people are usually blinded after being in power for too long, they forget that the real power is in the fist. Lorien commented casually as he sat on the other side of the long table, facing all three magistrates. He didn't show weakness or pretend to be humble. In a world where strength was the important dialogue, showing weakness or shyness was asking to be humiliated or devoured by hyenas. Lorien had to show these magistrates that he was not a teenager, he had to show that he was a man and a very powerful one, otherwise he would be devoured by these old men. So Lorien's words were a subtle threat, but obvious to anyone with common sense, which I'm sure most of the people present had, or at least partially. Daenerys and Nerys looked at Lorien with more admiration in her eyes. This was the man they wanted to marry, who wasn't intimidated by anything, even in the face of powerful magistrates meeting countless bronze knights. For Daenerys and Nerys, who had always lived in constant danger throughout their lives, Lorien simply seemed like the perfect man for them. This sense of security was something they had never felt in their lives. The eyes of the three magistrates of Myr changed with Lorien's words. For the first time they looked at the boy with solemn gazes and no longer saw an easily manipulated teenager, but a dangerous and truly powerful man. Countless thoughts passed through the minds of the three magistrates. They quickly changed their plans and smiled at Lorien as if they were looking at a long-lost son. Let's drink, let's drink. Joran, the youngest, said, raising his glass of wine, and everyone followed suit, raising their own glasses. The sound of toasts rang out in the banquet hall. No one talked business during the banquet, no one was foolish enough to do so. Seeing that the three magistrates were treating him with more respect, Lorien showed a satisfied look. He reminded himself that this wasn't Earth, where laws were still followed, this was a planet where strength spoke more than anything and being weak was the original sin. They're furious inside. Daenerys commented, whispering subtly to Lorien as she hid her lips with the wine glass. People could read lips, she didn't want others to find out what she was saying. They're probably used to being fawned over by Garrick and think they can buy everything with money, just like they do with the Dothraki hordes. Lorien replied in a calm tone, glancing discreetly at the smiling faces of the three magistrates of Myr. That's normal, we've visited all the free cities, they're all like that. Nerys, who was watching everything, spoke with a slightly sarcastic tone. She remembered every humiliation, every false and empty promise, every greedy and malicious look. Lorien nodded. He wasn't surprised. If something like this was common in this world, it was even more common on Earth. Politicians thought they were gods and the people worshipped something that should only be a representative of them. He never understood why people worshipped so many politicians. They were clearly corrupt, thieves, they broke more laws than anyone else, but people still loved them. That was something Lorien understood and didn't care about. What did someone's political opinion have to do with him? These magistrates were no different from politicians, especially in this world full of extraordinary power. Read the advanced chapters on my Patreon. GOTS. Read my other books. Game of Thrones, The God Emperor of Planetos, 500,000 words written. Percy Jackson. Godwin the Golden. Game of Thrones, Son of Zeus. 12 comments 0 vote. Chapter 14 The Banquet. The banquet continued merrily, the music playing and the women dancing for the guests, but whether it was Lorien or the magistrates, both sides wanted to resolve the issue of interests as quickly as possible. So, while the banquet was still in full swing, Lorien and the three magistrates went into a separate room and started talking business at the same moment. A slightly tense atmosphere hung in the air. Let's be direct, Lord Lorien. Durano was the first to speak, his eyes staring at the young man with a calm, deep gaze. Name your price. It all came down to interests. Lorien being present at the banquet only showed that he wanted gold or something else. That was good, a warrior without greed was no good to them. First of all, I don't like being disturbed, I want to focus on my training. Lorien didn't hesitate to speak his first wish. Of course, it was a lie, he just wanted to create an image of someone hardworking and focused on training. Which, if you think about the warrior's training method, was perfectly normal. Warriors train for decades for a breakthrough, so Lorien wanting to use this as a curtain to camouflage his true intentions was perfect. Lorien's first request didn't surprise Caliros, Durano or Joran, or rather, it didn't cause any reaction in them. Knowing warriors, they knew more than anyone that this type of man or woman only cared about advancing to the next stage. In his eyes, someone as talented as Lorien would focus on his training, because it was the most logical thing in the world. So they really weren't surprised by Lorien's request. The second thing is gold. Lorien spoke with a calm tone, knowing that he needed to create an army in the future. He would need a lot of gold to fulfill his ambitions. Raising an army was like raising a lion on gold. Joran's eyes lit up. Of all the three families that controlled Myr, the Vhassel family was the richest, basically controlling Myr's commercial fleet of ships. So they had plenty of gold. Since Lorien wanted gold, Joran would give it to them, especially if it brought the Vhassel family closer to Lorien. If he could arrange a marriage between one of his daughters and Lorien, that would be even better. And although the Voran and Tolis families weren't as rich, they were both immensely wealthy. If anyone contributed to even Khal Drogo's slaves having gold, it was the free cities of Myr, Tirosh and Li. These three cities practically financed Khal Drogo's Khalasar. The Vhassel family will give 20,000 gold coins every first day of the month. Joran said with a smile, although his smile made him look even more like a villain plotting something. The Tolis family will give 10,000 gold coins every first of the month. Durano, understanding Joran's intentions, spoke in a calm but somewhat helpless tone. 10,000 coins was the most he could give without disrupting his family's finances. The Voran family will give 15,000 gold coins every first of the month. Caliros said with a gentle smile, looking like a harmless grandfather, but his eyes kept looking at Lorien, trying to see something. In all honesty, Lorien had no idea what each other was worth in this world's monetary system, but knowing that gold was still a valuable metal, regardless of the world, he noticed that the price was very good. This wasn't paper money, but gold coins. The weight in gold that 20,000 coins would have was simply gigantic. If it were dumped in any country, it would probably break the local economy. Now, he would receive the sum of 45,000 gold coins every month without having to do anything. You could say he was enjoying all this money just by standing around. If that wasn't profit, Lorien had no idea what profit was. At the same time, Lorien wondered how rich these magistrates were, but he understood that a family with hundreds or thousands of years had a gigantic accumulation of capital, especially in Essos where the economy was more developed than in Westeros. Lorien began to give his terms, while the three magistrates also began to speak their own terms. However, Magistrate Caliro's next words made Lorien narrow his eyes. We need Lord Lorien to protect the city next month when Khal Drogo's horde of savages arrives. Lorien blinked and understood why the magistrates were so intent on winning him over. Obviously the greatest Khalasar of their time is approaching Myr again. And although the price paid by Lorien was great, it was still small compared to the price given to appease Khal Drogo. Rumor had it that even Khal Drogo's slaves had gold, and it was no lie. The gold came mainly from them. The amount that Myr handed over to Khal Drogo month after month was 3 times the salary of Lorien. It was so much gold that the city itself seemed to come to a standstill. Some services became impossible to maintain, and the port, the heart of Myr, plunged into complete inactivity, almost all work there simply ceasing. Although the price of maintaining Lorien was high, the magistrates did not hesitate to pay Lorien to protect the city. Paying Khal Drogo to prevent the looting of the city was a much higher price. And a bigger problem in the eyes of the three magistrates: if the Khalasar invaded the city, they, the magistrates, would be the first to die. Their mansions would be raided, the men killed and the women raped. Lorien pretended to think for a moment, but after a few minutes in silence, she nodded, making the three magistrates smile happily. The slightly tense atmosphere became lighter and everyone was satisfied with the negotiations. Let's get back to the feast, I'm starving. Joran said with a smile, feeling that the negotiations had gone very well. Although the price paid was expensive, he felt he was closer to Lorien than the other magistrates. The other magistrates agreed and took Lorien back to the banquet, which was still lively and full of wine and laughter. Lorien quickly located the 3 women of House Targaryen and approached them, none of whom were dancing or even drinking. I have to say, you're the most beautiful women in this place, but no one had the guts to ask you to dance. Lorien approached them and asked with a laugh. Nerys rolled her eyes and replied, looking at Daenerys with a teasing smile. With the cold, indifferent expression of the 3 of us, no man dared even approach. They're idiots who just want to take advantage of the 3 of us. Daenerys also replied with a slightly irritated tone at having to suffer so much harassment from the men around her. If it hadn't been a banquet, Daenerys would have shown these men what it means to be a little more respectful. As an advanced bronze knight, she had the confidence to beat these spoiled, arrogant young men. How did the negotiations go? Rayella asked in a low tone. She was a little worried about Lorien. The boy might be strong, but he was a teenager. Compared to the cunning and arrogant magistrates of Mur, he was like an innocent white rabbit. 45,000 gold coins every first day of the month in exchange for protecting the city and for them using my name to promote the city. Lorien replied with a smile, feeling quite satisfied with the negotiations. In the future, when Mur started making more money from his name, Lorien would act like a good capitalist and raise his fees. Just thinking about how much money he would get just standing around, he can't help but love this world. Without the gods around his neck, Lorien felt that this world had become very beautiful, which was a very good thing. Rayella, Nerys and Daenerys's eyes widened as they heard the price the magistrates had paid for Lorien to stay and protect Mur City. That was an astronomical sum of money. Looks like they're desperate. Rayella commented with a curious tone. Khal Drogo is coming to the city with his Khalasar of 100,000 men. Lorien replied with an indifferent tone. As for the 100,000 men, he didn't believe it one bit. This was an era when productivity was extremely low. Even House Lannister and House Tyrell couldn't feed an army of 100,000 men, let alone a nomadic tribe like the Dothraki. Not to mention the horses, the consumption of horses was many times greater than an average human being. 100,000 horses was enough to bankrupt even Braavos, one of the largest and richest cities in the world. Looting and hunting. If looting and hunting were enough to feed a tribe of over 100,000 people, humanity wouldn't have needed to create agriculture to develop over tens of thousands of years. To understand how important food was, human civilization could only develop when they stopped being hunter-gatherers and started growing food, and humanity began to gather in one place, creating the first cities. In Lorien's eyes, Khal Drogo had around 40,000 men and the rest were women, children and the elderly. The figure of 100,000 might be real, but the number of soldiers was definitely not 100,000. Rayella's face turned solemn at Lorien's words. This city is going to be in turmoil for a while. She sighed and said with a deep tone. Read the advanced chapters on my Patreon. Gots. Read my other books. Game of Thrones, The God Emperor of Planetos, 500,000 words written. Percy Jackson, Godwin the Golden. Game of Thrones, Son of Zeus. 10 comments 0 vote. Chapter 15 The Night of Conspiracies. Just as Rayella said, things got complicated with the imminent arrival of Khal Drogo. The first to know were the powerful families of Mur and then the wealthy merchants. If it had been before, these families would have been taking money out of their coffers and handing it over to the magistrates of Mur, but now, there was no sign of that. The reason for this was simple, just one name Lorien Morningstar. Just the fact that he was in town was enough to make people feel a sense of security. Even if Khal Drogo was crazy, antagonizing a 14-year-old golden warrior was like asking to be hunted down in the future. If Khal Drogo failed to kill Lorien, what would be expected was future revenge from a possible great warrior. And from what they knew, Lorien had lightning attributes, an extremely fast element and the ability to flee extremely quickly. If golden warriors were fast, Lorien was at least 3 times faster. With such an advantage, Khal Drogo would have to be crazy to antagonize Lorien, at least in the eyes of these families. Unfortunately, these people had forgotten something important. Men were proud, men with great power were even prouder. And things wouldn't happen the way they thought they would. At Olsen Manor. Unlike what some people thought, Lorien wasn't at all worried about the unrest in the city. Lorien was sitting staring at a book with a look full of interest. What he was holding was a book containing a breathing technique. More precisely, a beginner breathing technique, which could only be practiced up to the Silver Warrior stage. Breathing techniques had grades, the higher the grade, the higher the upper limit. Beginner, intermediate and advanced. A beginner breathing technique could be practiced until one became a Silver Warrior. An intermediate breathing technique could be practiced until becoming a Golden Warrior. An advanced breathing technique could be practiced until he became a Great Warrior. It was the first time he had seen a breathing technique, so he was very curious about everything. After reading the contents of the book, some of Lorien's doubts disappeared completely. A breathing technique was simply a highly precise muscular army of simply enormous intensity. Using the lineage, which was an innate power in all human beings, it was possible to start strengthening the human body and finally overcoming the shackles. Curiously, the lineage was only a hidden talent in the human body and could be excavated through the breathing technique. However, Lorien had to admire whoever created the first breathing technique. He was an absolute prodigy, because of him, the humanity of this world finally gained the strength to kill the monsters and the human race finally gained a foothold in the world. But to train, you need large quantities of food, which is in line with the law of conservation of energy. I'm curious how Rhaella trained Daenerys and Nerys in the conditions of living on the street. Theft. Lorien murmured, looking increasingly interested in the breathing technique. In Percy Jackson's world, having divine blood wasn't exactly much help to demigods. After all, having divine blood didn't make you a god, but in this world, how would his divine lineage react to breathing techniques? Can I become a god? When this thought appeared in Lorien's mind, he couldn't help but breathe slightly faster. Only those who have lived in a world full of monsters, gods and titans know the importance of being a plaything in the hands of the gods. Becoming a god was a desire that almost every demigod would have after carrying out a few missions. No longer wanting to lose their lives at the whim of the gods was a very strong motivation, especially among demigods who had never been taken in by their divine fathers and mothers. I need a few more books to start creating my own method based on this. Lorien murmured with a thoughtful look. Honestly, creating something based on something already done was infinitely easier than creating something from scratch. If he was going to create something from scratch like a breathing technique, Lorien didn't have the confidence to do it, but creating something based on a few breathing techniques wasn't that difficult. In his eyes, breathing techniques were an extremely advanced training method. Just change the movements and swap them for the ones he was more used to. After all, what really mattered was the lineage. The breathing technique was just the shovel while the lineage was the gold hidden in the ground. Lorien, I've finally found you. Hearing Daenerys' excited voice, a smile appeared on Lorien's lips. He began to enjoy the company of the three women of House Targaryen. All three women were interesting, especially Rhaella's two daughters, who were practically two sons full of energy and joy. Sitting down next to them on the sofa, Daenerys looked at Lorien and spoke in an excited tone. Carriages and more carriages have entered the mansion, all packed with gold coins and some jewels. Looks like they're afraid I'll run away. Lorien said with a laugh. It had only been a day, but the money had already arrived. He had to say that Khal Drogo was his lucky star. The man had practically facilitated his rise to power. They really are afraid. Daenerys agreed with his words, her lilac eyes narrowed with a shrewd look. You could raise your price, they've paid it with absolute certainty. Lorien looked at the girl speechlessly, but he really liked her idea, but he thought about it for a moment and put it aside. Let's not create enemies just yet, we want them relaxed rather than full of caution with me. Daenerys nodded, but she still wore a very cunning expression, which was rather cute in Lorien's eyes. Stop smiling like a villain, you greedy dragon. He said, pinching Daenerys' cheeks and molding them as he pleased. Daenerys showed a helpless expression. She noticed that Lorien especially enjoyed pinching her cheeks, but she didn't wear out from his touch either, she even liked it. She felt that if she had a brother, she would want him to be like Lorien. Dany, how much do you think assassins will charge to kill a magistrate? Using his wind powers, Lorien sensed that there was no one nearby and asked with a smile. The princess looked thoughtful, but spoke in a calm, deep tone. The mansions of the three magistrates are close to Garrick's mansion. A silver warrior will arrive at the mansion before any useless assassin can get past the bronze warriors in the mansions. If it's the faceless assassins, they'll carry out the assassination successfully, but it's extremely expensive. Lorien nodded, but after a moment's thought, put aside the idea of hiring an assassin. Trusting an assassin was like asking a scorpion not to sting its prey. Besides, Lorien had a much better way of causing chaos among the three magistrates of Myr. Especially between Joran and Doreno, both of whom already had a great rivalry, he just needed to set the fire and let it do the work. Together with Khal Drogo's pressure, it could be said that this city would become a volcano about to explode. Looking at the villainous expression on Lorien's beautiful face, Daenerys was speechless and wondered who the villain among them really was. However, Daenerys really enjoyed seeing this side of Lorien, as it showed that he wasn't just someone who was ambitious and had the ability to fulfill his own ambitions. Having ambition and no ability was a terrible thing, because it meant that at any moment they could die because of blind arrogance. Looking at Lorien, a smile appeared on Daenerys' lips. She felt like Visenya talking to Aegon before the conquest of Westeros. Together with her sister, they were practically Visenya, Rhaenys and Aegon ready to conquer the world. What did your mother say about the letter? Lorien turned to look at Daenerys and asked with a smile. He was curious if Raella would agree to go to Pentos and join Illyrio Mopatis, the magistrate of Pentos. The dragon princess gave him a sarcastic look and spoke with a cold tone. This magistrate obviously wants to use my family for his own nefarious purposes. Going to Pentos is like throwing yourself into a den of lions. How could we be so stupid? Daenerys discovered early on that the world was cruel, especially to women like her with extraordinary status. It wasn't arrogance, but being a princess, everyone wanted to marry her so that their descendants would be entitled to the Iron Throne. So when it came to men, she, Nerys and even Raella kept their distance. They would never know if they would be used as breeding mares by men. Honestly, if Lorien's character wasn't so good, they wouldn't even go near him. Lorien nodded, not at all surprised by Daenerys' words. Raella had to be very stupid to think that something so good would happen to her, an exiled queen. Anything free in the world was the most expensive. I'm rather curious though, the magistrate even promised 3 petrified dragon eggs. Daenerys said with a look full of longing when she mentioned dragon eggs. Like any Targaryen, the lust for a dragon was in her blood, especially hers. When we go to Pentos, we'll ask the magistrate nicely for dragon eggs. Lorien said with a cold smile. Daenerys understood Lorien's intentions and smiled just as coldly. Note: I invented changing the doors in my house and now I'm in a lot of trouble. It seems that my mind was telling me that everything was too calm and invented something to make my life more chaotic. Read the advanced chapters on my Patreon. Gots. Read my other books. Game of Thrones, The God Emperor of Planetos, 500,000 words written. Percy Jackson. Godwin the Golden. Game of Thrones, Son of Zeus. To be continued.